Hello and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch of History. Today's episode, The Professor and the Widower, American Leaders of the War. I'll discuss the political leader and the military leader of the U.S. entry into the war. Would be Woodrow Wilson and General John Pershing. Start the beginning of our sketch now. So we have John Pershing and Woodrow Wilson, who led the U.S. effort during the war. The war began on April 6, 1917. On April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson addressed the joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. And on the 6th, he received this declaration of war. Woodrow Wilson was kind of an unlikely figure to make this request, as he had been an adamant in favor of neutrality during among his previous term in office. He was just reelected in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and being sworn into office in 1917, or beginning his second term, only a few months later, entered into the war. I don't think this wouldn't be because Woodrow Wilson was chomping at the bit to get into the war, but as we discussed in previous videos, that there are pressures and aspects outside of a nation that push and pull it towards war. And you could argue for good or for bad, those pressures succumbed to Woodrow Wilson, and he felt that entering the war was the only moral option the United States had. So Woodrow Wilson asked for a declaration of war, and he gives a speech to Congress, and you can look up this speech. It's not hard to find online, and I would recommend reading it. It encapsulates a lot of things that I think are uniquely American. The concepts of what the United States' role in the world is, what example it plays to the world, what the United States values in international relationships. Essentially, much of what we now think of as standard thought and in American foreign policy originates from this speech. But war comes, and he outlines three primary reasons for the United States joining the war. The first, I'll draw a little German helmet here, the spike on the top. The first, he outlines essentially what we would call war crimes perpetrated by the German army, and how that this action essentially is not tolerable in a civilized society. Secondly, little submarine here. He outlines the renewal of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic that Germany is conducting against Great Britain. Again, viewed as a crime against international law, and also something that was viewed as savage and uncivilized. And finally, and most directly affecting the United States, the Zimmerman telegram, where Great Britain's intelligence services intercept a telegram sent to the government of Mexico, or one of the governments. Mexico was actually in the middle of a revolution, but essentially offering that in exchange for Mexico declaring war on the United States, that Germany would turn over certain territories after the war to Mexico from the United States, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. It also alluded that the Germans were also reaching out to the Japanese and potentially offering them the United States West Coast in exchange for help during the war. Neither Mexico or Japan had any interest in this deal, but it was enough to push over American sentiment that essentially Germany was a threat to the United States in a very direct and real way, not a distant war across the ocean, but something that would threaten peace and security of continental U.S. And this supported war, which was almost unanimously voted for. Now, Woodrow Wilson's justifications for the war were pretty typical for that time, or frankly any time that a nation goes to war. There was a perceived threat. The war had to be waged to end this threat. But Wilson does something quite radical at this point. And again, this is why I'd recommend reading his speech. He really goes and outlines some of these concepts. He introduces the concept that the United States needs to go to war not to defeat Germany, not that as the primary goal, but this was an idea that this was a war that would end war. So, I don't know if you can see that, but I write war. And this is where we start seeing this term, even though it was used prior to this, the war to end all wars. Wilson starts to embark on something that it sounds almost apocalyptic in nature, that this was somehow a final cataclysmic conflict that would usher in a new era into humanity. It sounds extreme, but in some ways you have to realize that this conflict, even at this point, the war was not over, was already the most destructive war that humanity had ever seen. This was something new, and I think there was a sense that something new might come out of it. The phrase, the war to end all wars, actually doesn't come from Wilson. It comes from the science fiction writer H.G. Wells. Wilson never actually said it in that way, but his policies can very much be summed up in that phrase. And in fact, I think a term that he uses maybe a little more technical, but not quite as poetic as he says that the purpose of the war was a just and secure peace, not merely a new balance of power. Essentially meaning that this wasn't a matter of fighting a war so the United States and the Allies could come out on top. This was a way of somehow restructuring the international order, that wars like this in the future would not happen. And we have a bit of an issue here that Wilson declares war on April 6, 1917, or Congress does. But the United States has no capacity to wage a war of any kind. It had a minuscule army, a navy that wasn't suited to be involved in the current conflict. So instead of the United States leaping into battle in April 1916, it engages in a long process of gearing itself up to wage a war, which would not really start for the United States in any real sense until 1918. In that time, Wilson outlines what his goals are for the war, and he goes about a lot of efforts trying to sell this to the American people and also to the international community. And he does this by outlining what was known as the 14 points. And you probably remember this from your high school history classes, but essentially the 14 points were, again, there are obviously 14 different points of that the new peace needed to encompass to prevent future conflicts. And this is a very complicated topic. So I'll keep it very, very simple. There were basically three aspects to the 14 points, or that the points fall into, that try to encompass what his goals would be to prevent future wars after the end of the war. The first one was it's tried to write vote there, voting both. The spread of democracy. He also argued that the financial system, international financial system, needed to be restructured to be a level playing field so that no single nation or group of nations could rig international finance in their favor. And lastly, he wanted to see the establishment of the League of Nations, which would be an international body where nations could work out their differences through diplomacy and a set organization as opposed to needing to resort to war. The 14 points are also notable for what they don't talk about. They don't talk about the punishment of any aggressor nations. In many ways, in Wilson's mind, the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire that started the war were to blame, but they were also, in many ways, the nations that were on the receiving end, or the Allied nations, were also in some ways responsible for the start of the war. That not one nation was to blame, but the way the international structure was set up was to blame. That essentially it made war inevitable when a crisis arose. Now, it's pretty easy to dismiss Wilson's aims as naive. The war to end all wars, even to today, gets mocked or used as kind of a way to show the futility of the war, the concept, given that the Second World War would begin just 2 decades later. But it's worth noting that Wilson's 14 points did play a major role in bringing Germany to the negotiation table. Had Germany not felt like they could get a good peace, it is likely the war would have dragged on into 1919. Instead, it ended in 1918. That's not very legible, but hopefully you're listening. So, in fact, the war was building up. The Allied war plans had the rather lacking in creativity Plan 1919, which was the final big push that would take place in 1919 to end the war. Had Germany expected the harsh treatment that it would receive at the end of the war, it probably would have fought on to try to get better terms, and probably would have led to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of more casualties. So, in that sense, in a real concrete sense, not in a theoretical sense, the 14 points did have an impact on history in that moment in the First World War. But beyond that, we don't really know what the vision that Wilson had after the war would have looked like, because his attempts to implement the 14 points fell apart. So we have the post-war world that directly led to World War II, and we don't really know. There's no way to really say that the world that is outlined, that was Wilson's goal to create at the end of the war, would have been any better had he been able to achieve it. But I think that there are two aspects that we can take at least a decent guess that it is possible that had Wilson been successful in implementing his 14 points or a variation thereof, that the post-war world would have been better. Or at least that his plans would have been mildly successful. And that is that, first of all, in all of world history, there has never been a point in history where a free and democratic nation has gone to war against another free and democratic nation. So Wilson's attempts to spread democracy, based on just what we understand as historical fact at this point, would have lessened the likelihood of wars between nations. Also, we can look at a concrete example of after World War II. We have President Harry Truman is the leader of the United States and the most powerful nation on earth at the close of the war. Interesting side note that Harry Truman was actually a World War I veteran himself and fought in the Meuse Argonne. And here he was now 25 some odd years later, ending the war, um, ending the war of the Second World War. And if you don't have your history right on this, Harry Truman became president rather abruptly. He was vice president when Roosevelt died. And when he was sworn into office in the White House, you would think that he would maybe have a portrait of Roosevelt hanged or hung that he would be sworn in front of. But in fact, he wasn't. He deliberately had himself sworn in under a portrait of Woodrow Wilson. And he looked to Woodrow Wilson for inspiration on how to end the Second World War. And we see some of the things that Truman put into place. The establishment of the UN, so a bit of an extension of the League of Nations, or that concept. We saw the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, a play on essentially rewriting international finance rules. And there was at least a moderate effort by the Allies to try to transition governments to democratic institutions after the war. We see West Germany becoming a democratic nation. We also see Japan becoming a democratic nation, the two autocratic foes of the United States during the war. And you can argue that this has been somewhat successful. There has not been a major war between major powers since the Second World War, not a direct war anyway. And invasions of one independent nation invading another independent nation with the intent to annex territory in the later half of the 20th century was quite rare compared to the earlier part of the 20th century and the 19th century, where this was not a common practice, certainly not something that turned any heads in the international community. Now, this structure, I think, is unique to Wilson. I think that only someone like President Wilson would have tried to field something like this. And I think a part of that is that he had a PhD in political science. He had a long history in academia. He was the president of Princeton University. And I think that this academic background and his lent itself to trying to construct a theoretical post-war structure that's grander than I think most leaders would have tried to attempt. It's also worth noting that, as I said, Wilson had a PhD. He's also the only U.S. president who has ever had a PhD. Now, Wilson was a fascinating man, but I want to be reluctant not to seem that I'm overwhelmingly praising him. He was not without his demons and personal failings. He was a jumble of contradictions. He was a giant in international diplomacy, but he was also his own worst enemy because of his unwillingness to compromise, his tendency to be, frankly, petty and dealing with people on personal levels. He championed freedom and equality abroad, but at the same time, he held deeply prejudicial views, and he engaged in some of the worst crackdowns on civil liberties that the U.S. has ever seen. He also supported the propagation of racial discrimination laws in the United States. So, Wilson was not a hero or a villain as much as he was a human being in history, who his actions sent ripples out in many directions, some good, some bad. And as I said, we know what the post-World War II world looked like based on his philosophy, but we don't know what the First World War would have looked like, or the peace of the First World War, had Wilson been able to accomplish his goals. But Wilson did believe that it was worth fighting for. This concept of a war to end war was not only worth fighting for, but worth expending a huge amount of resources and lives to achieve. And to wage this war was handed off to General John Pershing. Now, Uh, John Pershing was probably, if there was a stereotype of a rigid military man, it's John Pershing. He was known to be a stickler for discipline, compliance to rules down to the letter. He was strict. He was a by-the-book soldier. I think you would probably say by today's standards we could call him a workaholic. So John Pershing equals work. And he had a unique role during the First World War. He became, when he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson, he was appointed to be General of Armies, which, in a sense, is somewhat the equivalent of a 6-star general, which is not really a thing, but they gave it to him. And the only other person to hold this rank in U.S. history was General George Washington. It has not been held before or since. He was given essentially supreme command over the entire U.S. military, or at least the U.S. Army. And let's track his history a little bit to see what brought him to this level. Pershing initially joined the Army with the intent to pay for school. He thought about being a lawyer, but eventually took to soldiering life. He was the commander of the 10th Cavalry, one of the Buffalo Regiment, or Buffalo Soldier Buffalo Soldier Regiments, meaning that he commanded a cavalry regiment that consisted of African American soldiers led by white officers. By all accounts, Pershing was well respected by his men and rather uncharacteristic for the time. He viewed African American men as capable and competent and having a place in the Army. This was not a widely held belief in the Army at the time, and it has actually led to a certain aspect that some of you might have heard of Pershing. He was known, even at the papers at the time, he had the nickname of Blackjack Pershing, which sounds rather dashing, but its origins are less so. For a time, he was an instructor at West Point, and he had this nickname, but instead of black, it was replaced by the N-word. And this was used as an insult on the basis of his history commanding African Americans and his known views on them. Over time, when it got republished in papers, and also because even at that time, the N-word was considered not a word. It was to be used in polite society. It was deemed offensive. So the nickname came. I never read anywhere how he felt about it. I've never heard him referring to himself by it, so I don't think he cared for it. But this does raise an interesting aspect about Pershing, though, is that though he did seem to have personal views towards African Americans and their role and abilities within the Army, he did next to nothing to address the rampant discrimination against African Americans in the armed forces, and he signed off on many of the policies that treated African American soldiers quite poorly. And again, as I said, I've become quite interested in this topic, and it's I don't want to go too far afield on it because I believe it deserves its own detail, but there are some very interesting policies that were passed in the U.S. Army in regard to African American soldiers, and I do believe that a big part of this was that there was a fear that if African American men were to be given a sense of confidence and responsibility and to be shown respect, that they would start to demand that respect in other aspects of their life, which was something that American society was unwilling to do at this time. But again, this is a whole other topic, but I do think that it is something that's kind of, as I said, caught my interest, and I think it's worth looking into and studying yourself if it sounds like something that'd be interesting to you. though disagreeing personally with these policies, I think Pershing's view was that his duty was to win the war, and that trying to reform racial policy within the Army would be an unnecessary distraction. To this day, there are academics that argue that he was right, and there are academics that argue that he was wrong. But moving along with his military history, he went on to take commands in the Spanish-American War, the Philippines-American War, the Mexican Border War. All of these were called wars, though they were rather minuscule by World War I standards. But Pershing had shown himself to be a competent commander. He had experience that was not common in the U.S. military. He had led American soldiers on foreign soil. He had had experience dealing with government officials and foreign peoples, again, from everywhere from Cuba to Mexico, the Philippines. He was deemed that he would be uniquely suited to be the leader of the American military because he would be dealing with a number of cultures and leaders of foreign militaries in France, and they thought that this experience would suit him. Part of his character was shaped before the war broke out, but not long before. Personal tragedy struck Pershing in 1912. There was a house fire in which his wife and 3 young daughters were killed, leaving only his 6-year-old son as his surviving family. After this occurred, Pershing absorbed himself into his work even more so than he had before. So, again, coming back to work. And to the point which I think most people would consider obsessive. And this was to have consequences later in the war with his essentially desire to be constantly involved down to the lowest level that he possibly could be. So, as I said, this led up to his career. Leading up to the war, Wilson believed that he was the right man for the job, and he was put to lead the American Expeditionary Force, which was the name of the U.S. Army being deployed to Europe during the war. Wilson gave Pershing 2 orders, which is quite unique to receive orders these plain and simple. The United States was to have an equal and independent command from France and Great Britain. The United States needed to be an independent army. Pershing was not to allow U.S. units to be handed over to be commanded by French and British generals. The other thing that he was order that he was given is that the United States needed to make a sufficient showing of itself on the battlefield that the United States would be able to have a seat at the table when peace talks begin. So, in short, win. And the reason for this is that Wilson had his 14 points. This was a radical position. It was not something that the French and British were particularly interested in. They weren't interested in restructuring the post-war world to be a level playing field. They weren't interested in going easy on Germany. And the only way that Wilson could possibly make these arguments is if essentially this right to have a seat at the table was purchased with U.S. lives and U.S. military force during the war. And that's it. Wilson had next to nothing to do with how the war was waged. He put all of his energy into keeping support for the war high, getting the U.S. economy footing appropriate to, on a war footing, appropriate to raise the army that was needed to meet these 2 orders. But no general in U.S. history has ever, and I've read this enough places I can say it confidently, that no U.S. general has ever had as much autonomy to run a war as Pershing did. He essentially had next to no oversight by Congress or the president on his decisions. So You can look and see how the course of the war was waged, and you can compare that. I know that that's been something that's a bit of a sticking point in U.S. history, is that sometimes it's felt that politicians meddle too much in military affairs. Others feel not enough. This was certainly a time where the political leadership definitely had a hands-off approach towards the military. But even with all this autonomy, Pershing had a massive problem at the outbreak of the war. Germany's army was huge, experienced, and well-armed and well-led. And for all intents and purposes, the United States did not have an army. This is kind of a hard thing for us to understand today. We think of the U.S. of having a large and powerful land army. That's just part of its DNA, but not in 1917. In 1917, I'll start here. The U.S. Army consisted of about 100,000 men. This would have been smaller than any European army at this time, smaller than Belgium, possibly roughly the size of Montenegro, but probably not. Now, this is only about 8% of what the U.S. Army is today, so you can see how much larger it is today. But European armies at this time were generally measured in millions. And to boot, the United States Army, though it had experience in anti-insurgency warfare in the Philippines and in Mexico, it had not fought a large-scale battle since the U.S. Civil War, and it was poorly equipped by European standards. To give you a sense of how small this army would have been on a World War I battlefield, the United States declared war on April 6, 1917, and on April 16th, the Allies launched the Nivelle Offensive. The battle would go from April 16th to May 9th. In that time, the Allies would suffer 350,000 casualties. So, at this point, if the entire U.S. Army were to be transplanted to the European battlefields, it would last about 2 weeks. Now, not only would that be a shocking slaughter to the American people, it would also in no way achieve these goals of winning or keeping the U.S. command separate. It would also be hard to argue that an army so small would even have the right to have a secondary command. So the United States had to find a way to face its threat. So I'll draw another German helmet here, which on the Western Front at this time was about 5 million men. So there needed to be a way to get this small army to be something much more massive. And the only way to do it that quickly was through a massive draft. And a little interesting side note here with you, you can see the type of casualties that the U.S. Army was expecting. Like I said, 350,000 casualties in 2 weeks. It was understood that this would be a bloody war. And there was a lot of this preparation as the U.S. Army was preparing. It was also trying to prepare the civilian population to be prepared for such losses. In fact, you probably have heard the term Gold Star family or a Gold Star mother. A Gold Star mother, and that these are individuals who lost someone in the military. Someone died during combat. This term actually originates from the beginning of the First World War, because prior to this, the U.S. tradition, the tradition during the Civil War, was to hang black shrouds over the front door of a home or a window of an apartment to show that a son or father or some other relative had died during the war. And there was this fear, because there were memories during the Civil War with whole streets just lined with black shrouds. And I guess there was a sense that this would be sapping to morale, so they encouraged people to hang a flag with a gold star, something of a point of honor as opposed to mourning. Um, so again, I just think that's an interesting side note, how we can see how the war has affected us to today, and how they try to change the perception um, of the of what it was to have a a son or father die in combat. It's also worth noting that this was the first time the United States had fought a major war outside its borders. There had been other wars, but nothing to this scale. Um, so this was something new for the United States, to send hundreds of thousands of its young men to another country to fight. So again, there was a concern of, if the casualties started to mount, what would the perception be? So this draft and volunteer drive began, and by the end of the war, the U.S. Army numbers about 4 million. Now, not all of those make it to Europe, but those were the people who were raised and in training. Now, to give you a sense of the scope of this and how large the U.S. Army became, that's about 4.9% of the population of the United States was in the Army. And you might think, 3.9%, so almost 4%. So you might think, 4% is not that much. But if you would consider that if 4% of the U.S. military, or of the U.S. population today, were members of the military, we would have a military of about 12.5 million people, which would be by far the largest army in the world. China would be a distant second at 2.2 million. So the United States would have 10 million more people under arms than any other nation on Earth. So if we were to do that, I can guarantee you that other nations would start expanding their armies as well, because they'd probably want to know what we were up to. But suffice it to say, it was a huge shift in American culture. But there was a problem. 4 million men get moved into the American Expeditionary Force, but as I said before, the U.S. military was under-equipped, and it didn't have weapons for these soldiers. So what ended up happening was that prior to this, during the war, there were lots of U.S. factories making weapons, but they were making weapons for the French and for the British. Now, when you are running and building a factory to prepare military equipment, it takes a long time to get a factory up and running. You have to make tools to be able to even start to make the weapons. It can take months or even years. So instead of the United States going to war with American-designed weapons, much of what they fought with, in fact almost all of it, was U.S. and French equipment simply re-stamped to U.S. and sent to the Army. So these private companies that initially had been selling French designs and British designs to the French and British Army were now selling French designs and British designs to the U.S. Army, which they were manufacturing under license. And the British and French had no problems with this whatsoever. It would make the supply problems somewhat easier once the United States came into the war. And it was a way to get the U.S. soldiers into the war quicker. So, but that said, it would not be until 1918 that the American Expeditionary Force reached Europe in any sufficient numbers to have any impact on the war, and even then, it would not be a particularly well-trained army. I read many accounts of soldiers who didn't even see the rifle that they would be using until they arrived in Europe. They either were given dummy rifles or an old, outdated rifle to practice with. So here was the problem of the United States faced. You had a new army, barely or poorly trained, lacking in experience. Only 10,000 of these 4 million, only 100,000 of these 4 million soldiers had any experience in the military until months prior, sometimes only even weeks prior to going into combat. And to begin with that, they had to learn weapons that they were not familiar with, that even these 100,000 soldiers had no experience with because they were French and British designs. Um, Much of this was beyond Pershing's control to try to fix, but not entirely. Pershing had two preconceived notions about the war that would cost the American Expeditionary Force very dearly. First of all, he did not think much of Europeans, which, to be honest, at that time wasn't an uncommon opinion, and I guess you could argue even amongst certain segments of the United States isn't an uncommon opinion now. Um, but he and much of the staff and the military believed, and I'm not kidding with this, that any Europeans worth their salt had immigrated out of Europe to the United States a long time ago. So the only ones left there were lazy aristocrats and peasants that lacked gumption. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but just a little bit. Pershing believed that the deadlock on the Western Front had a lot to do with a lack of fighting spirit. He felt that once, aggressive, strong, right-thinking Americans got onto the battlefield, that they would be able to overcome these deadlocks and break through the fighting, which had been essentially static for 3 years. So you have to keep in mind that with this mindset that Pershing has, there's the old saying that when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So for the rest of the war, all the directives that came out of Pershing's office to the American Expeditionary Force was to engage head-on, be aggressive, and be quick. Now this led to massive casualties during the war. And you may argue comes from a source of callousness or incompetence on Pershing's part. But I think to look at the context of what Pershing was facing, you can maybe not give him a pass, but at least look at his perspective, that this war had been raging for a long time. And Pershing believed that the reason the stalemate had occurred was because a lack of generals and officers to be aggressive enough that there would be casualties. So in his mind, by not being aggressive, in fact, many, many more soldiers were dying because it wasn't ending the war. It was allowing it to drag forward. I think, as you'll see as we go on, this was not a correct assumption, but it came from a perception that this would be the way that in the long run would save American lives, to be essentially pay the cost up front as opposed to dragging it out. Another preconceived notion that he had was that all battles essentially came down to the infantryman, his rifle, and his bayonet. And U.S. soldiers were trained extensively on target shooting and bayonet drills. And these were things that had served Pershing well in the past. In his experience in low-intensity conflicts against insurgents in the Philippines and Mexico, having soldiers that didn't panic, that could shoot accurately at long distances, that were willing to engage up close to the enemy, it suited well those conflicts. But he viewed this as the primary way to win a war, and he viewed reliance on things, more modern aspects of warfare like machine guns and artillery, as too slow and too ponderous to be useful in the lightning advances that he envisioned would occur once Americans hit the field. And as a result, the American soldier during the First World War was ill prepared for modern conflict. Luckily, American soldiers didn't come from a long military tradition, and individual soldiers were much more comfortable with being flexible and adapting to circumstances compared to many European soldiers that came from more tradition-bound armies. So at the beginning of the war, these instructions coming down from the top were usually followed to the letter, and towards the end of the war, the orders went out, but the Americans simply co-opted the ways of fighting the war that the French, German, and British had developed over the past years. So So if we were to look at this as a scale, on the one hand, we have, for the American Expeditionary Force, we have poor equipment, we have poorly trained soldiers, we have a poor strategic doctrine. Things aren't looking too good for the Americans coming in, but they did have some advantages. The American soldier had very high morale, was very enthusiastic. So after the war, there would be a lot of recrimination and sort of doubt of what it was all for. At the time of the war, most American soldiers believed pretty strongly in what they were doing. They also had, not unlike the European soldier who had been fighting the war for months, if not years, they had given up on this concept that, one more push, one more attack will get us through, one more will end the war. They had heard that far too many times. But the American soldiers did believe this, and it led to them to be very aggressive, and they were not quick to give up. So we have a bit of the pros and cons. This led them to almost be suicidal at points. In fact, there's a let's see if I can find it here. There was an interesting German intelligence report that came out after the war that was circulated amongst German officers that said what to expect when facing Americans. And it said that the Americans were brave, often to the point of being suicidal, that they learned quickly, and were decent soldiers, but they were poorly organized, often poorly led, and tended to lack imagination beyond direct attacks. And as we'll see during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the Germans were not that far off the mark with their intelligence reports. So with that, we have Woodrow Wilson and John Pershing at the head of the war effort, with an entire nation being mobilized underneath it to create this 4 million man army.